start some recording. So Miriam, I'm going to turn it right over to you for Natalia Ginzburg's The Little Virtues.
Very, very good. I'm glad that you didn't start discussing it and that this has worked out okay. Hi, everyone. Well,
Hi.
maybe we can just go around and just give our initial impressions, and then we can look at some of the questions and see if any of those questions speak to us.
I'd be happy to start.
Great, Robert.
100 pages. So unbelievably great. I read it twice because I just kept underlining everything. A wonderful voice. I mean, that's what I really appreciated, was the voice. And the fact that it wasn't organized chronologically was a little off-putting at first, because I wanted to sort of track how she changed as she aged, but it was still possible. There were only a couple that were from the 60s that were kind of stuck in there. But I just thought also it was the most wonderful translation. This book seemed to me like it was written in English. And Italian, I've had experience with. Jim and I have been translating a book from Spanish into English, which was originally written in Italian, and it's not easy. So I really appreciated the translation, and I loved the incredible eye, the incredible attention to detail. Sometimes this real honesty and self-examination. Also, some of the sarcasm was good and fun. So it was altogether a variety, and really, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Anyone else on their initial impressions?
Well, I'll
Okay, go ahead, jump in.
I guess maybe 180 degrees.
We're used to that.
I agree that the translation was excellent. I did not particularly enjoy the book. And that's probably philosophical. I guess, and I'm doing something that I'm criticizing. I got a little bit tired of the I. I felt it to be very egocentric, maybe just, for example, when she talked about the creative way of going about becoming an author and so on and so forth. Okay, I got your point. You don't really have to say it again and again and again. It was like, okay, enough is enough. I don't know. I thought it was an interesting book. I probably philosophically feel very different from the author, which may somewhat bias how I look at the whole book. So maybe that's why I perhaps didn't enjoy it quite as much as you did.
It didn't speak to you.
It did not speak to me.
I'm sure. Anyone else on your initial reaction to the book? Doreen, do you have any ideas?
I would say I liked and not loved. So we have three different, right? Loved, didn't love, liked. I also read it twice because I found her fascinating. I can't even describe how she writes. I don't think I've ever quite read anybody like that. There's not dialogue. There's these like long sentences, but they kind of slide. Everything kind of slides into each other, and like with these very small changes that before you know it, when they're all made into a chain, it's a huge change. And you go, how did she get from here to here with like this slippery, slidey, yummy, and I kept thinking, like in the one of human relations, I don't know if any of you have seen I think it's a Pixar movie about Venezuela. It's called Up.
Oh, yeah.
And there's this wonderful scene at the beginning that's maybe like 5 minutes, where it tells the whole history of this couple's relationship just in images, like putting on the tie and wedding picture and this whole thing. And it just, in a very short time, it tells their whole life, like maybe. And that's how I felt like she was. She had this way of just kind of, I don't even know how she did it. And there was a lot of wisdom. And there was also sometimes, to agree with Jay, sometimes I felt like she generalized based on her experience into something that maybe isn't everybody's experience. And sometimes that was a little jarring, but I admired her writing and her voice.
Great. I'll jump in, and I love it when I think the book club meetings are always more interesting when we have disagreements, right? So having everyone on the same page,
Yes.
it's kind of like, it's nice, but it's much more interesting to me when we have some disagreement. I think Little Virtues is a little gem, and I was caught by the third sentence. The long day of sunshine on the low parched hills, the yellow dust in the streets, and the baby's dysentery come to an end, and winter begins. And so there's a like quirkiness there, and completely disassociated things. In fact, I think like all really good writers, she is quite eccentric, and along with that, brave and insightful. But at the same time, the quirkiness is a little bit, over the top at times. And one of the tics that I think maybe Doreen was just getting at, and I just is the generalization. She uses the royal we forever, right? So eventually that kind of bothered me. So that just that she's saying, okay, we do this, we do this, we do this, and we do this, and you're like, well, who is we? Are you a class of people that you're talking about? And yeah, you give leeway to an author once they've gained your trust, and she gained my trust quite quickly. You give them a lot of leeway, but the eccentricity did kind of fall into quirkiness at times, and it was jarring. Mostly what I found is that she was never boring.
Yeah.
And I think that is a high compliment also. So that's the eccentricity and quirkiness, that you just don't know what she's going to say next. And I agree with Doreen as well. Some of it really is kind of unconnected. So that she'll say one thing and then jump somewhere else. But it's great because in that sense that I was always on my toes. Her dedication to her vocation is total, and that's attractive. But there's a lot of weird stuff here also. So I look forward to talking about it more.
Yeah. Well, since I chose the book, I'm also very interested in this book, and I loved your saying that it is a gem and very unusual. And what I admire so much about Ginzburg is the distillation. Her work seems so distilled. That's born of years of experience, even though I think some of these essays were not written in her old age. But that kind of distillation and refinement and her way of thinking. I also admired her powers of description. I also admired her restraint. There's something very austere about it, and spare. so that when she does expand that into a richer description, it registers even in a stronger way. I also admire her anti-bourgeois point of view. It was very, very refreshing to read. And the one about the shoes,
Oh, yeah.
we can say, let's all be careful. Let's all wear good, solid shoes and never get our feet wet. But what an interesting way to talk about one's feelings about class and bourgeois solidity without delivering a big lecture about it. She doesn't do that. She focuses on the shoes. So I'm very interested in her. And also, what's very poignant to me also was that she lived through fascism. Her husband was tortured and killed by the fascists. And her point of view was so deeply informed by that period in Italy. There's no getting around that. And how restrained she is when she mentions that.
Mm.
We don't hear about it when she's talking about the Abruzzo. We don't hear about it until the very end of that first
Right.
essay.
Yeah, it's a mystery. Like, why are they there? You don't really know. And you look at the date and you go, okay, maybe that's what they're in
Yeah,
sort of internal exile. But
they were sent into exile, and then he came back. It's a very, very sad story. The interesting thing also is that, she was a member of parliament and became political, was a member of the Communist Party. Of course, the Italian Communist Party is not the Russian Communist Party. But she doesn't lecture us about that. She's not doctrinaire in that way. So I would love to hear if you have a favorite essay, which one might that be? And we can do that. We can talk about the essays in that way. It'd be interesting to see if we overlap in any way.
right.
Robert, do you?
Well, I
have a
went first
favorite?
at the beginning, so I can go first here. I was really torn between he and I and human relationships. And I had to settle on he and I because of how it didn't resonate like parallel. My relationship with Jim, it is so embedded in the difference that she's expressing here. He manages in his own way to speak even languages he doesn't really know. I mean, that's Jim, I'll tell you. But there's not that many direct comparisons. What it mostly is the push-pull, the likes, dislikes, and the comparisons, and this intense kind of honesty regarding herself, and often self-deprecating, and praise for him, but sarcasm too. Like when she's talking about food, he says, I don't know anything about food. Oh, but he is so discerning. He has them bring over wine. And I'm thinking, oh my God, don't we all know people who say, oh, I don't take the wine back, or bring me 3 bottles. I want to examine the label. Oh, it's just this awful behavior. So she's indicting him in a way, but each one of them is sort of hard to like in some ways, but they're also lovable in others. I mean, there are certain traits of each of them, and that's really what I think. If you look at page 84, there's a thing here that relates to Jim too, that's something that he's always talked about. If you've ever heard of Leo Bersani, he's a California professor who's written a book called Homos, which is about same-sex relations. And she says at the bottom of page 84, in which house in the city, at which point on earth does this person live who is right for us, who is like us in every way, who is ready to answer all our questions, ready to listen to us forever without getting bored? Well, that's exactly not what at least my relationship with Jim is about. We couldn't be more different. And I think that's one of the things that people who don't get gay marriage or gay relationships. They just think it's about sameness, and it is completely not. It's the same. It's the same as every relationship in the world that's heterosexual. And I think that's, that's not her end point. I mean, this is a question she's asking herself in this human relationships essay, but I think she gets that the counterpoint and the counterbalance, like she talks about at the very, very end when she's talking about the way that she changed, that they changed when they were she was trying to remind him of the walk that they took. And he says, oh, I remember that. And she says, no, he didn't really remember it.
He's lying, right?
Yeah,
She's
he's lying. Because you know what? We're not the same people. And we can't just recreate that. But this is all about the maturation and change that happens in a relationship that's totally natural. And I loved the way she charts that. It's very sweet in a way, I think. So that's why I picked that one as my favorite.
And you could also say it embodies her view of marriage, that one doesn't have to be like the other person. And she's writing from a position of extreme confidence that she can say these kinds of things about him.
Yeah.
And she's writing from a point of kind of stillness. She's the lazy one.
Yeah.
He's on the couch. And
She's the sloppy one.
Right, he can do 5 things at once. He can talk on the phone, he could type, he could, do all of these things. And so he's this figure of action somehow, and she observes that he's full of energy. Of course, the ironic thing in their own lives, he died way before she did and left her. But I love the way she nails him. I mean, she knows him so well, doesn't she?
Yeah.
So absolutely. And the tremendous confidence that she has to be able to say these things. And I also agreed with what you said about how she criticizes herself, that she too, descended into rages, and that hers would go on and trail this kind of resentment almost endlessly. So
yeah, she says during the Montesi trial, because of his respect for established authority, we had very violent arguments.
Yeah.
And that comes right after she's gone about some slight differences. And then she comes out with violent arguments, which is, it makes me think she's not telling you everything, but she's letting you know that these things happened.
Yes. Well, I think it was W.H. Auden who said something about there are the savers and then the ones who spend, the expansive souls. So here he's got a closets full of shirts and ties. He has an enormous number of shirts and ties. He fills the bath to overflowing. He is super abundant in everything. And that reminds me of John, of my, he's got his shirts and it's just like doubles and triplicates and everything. And I'm just the opposite.
Right.
I love to get rid of things and he loves to gather things. So she gets that,
I mean, it's contrapuntal, but it's an observation that is kind of maybe not universal, but people can recognize this, even if it's not exactly the same. It's that yin yang.
Yes, definitely. Ben, I think you had something to say.
Yeah, I had a tough time choosing which essay I liked the most, and He and I was one of them. And maybe we'll talk more about it again a little bit later, but for another reason, and that was I found her as a writer the most attractive in that essay. And it was the humility and humbleness, the self-criticism, which was tantalizing because we already know her. And in some ways, she turned her husband into this, incredible figure of competence. and yet you could, I think she's underselling herself. But it was just, it's so attractive in a writer that she wasn't beating her own breast. But I will say the others, I really appreciated Silence. I also really appreciated England, Eulogy. 'Cause I spent my first summer abroad was working for interning for the BBC in England, and not quite as early as she made it, but only several decades later. So I saw a lot of that still. But the
Yeah,
one
that
I
was
most
61.
liked that I wanted to discuss was the Portrait of a Friend.
Oh,
As-
yeah.
Okay, and there's some obvious reasons why. I mean, there's a nice, kind of reverberation going on here. That the friend is both the city and the man,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of weaving back and forth. You get to work on those two levels. And then she also, and there's ambivalence. I mean, the city where she grew up, so few things remain alive for us, and we are oppressed by a throng of memories and shadows, which again is a startling thing. Not the normal kind of nostalgia you're used to. But I wanted to point out, it's actually in this, I think probably most of us have this edition, if I'm guessing right. But on page 16, when talking about the man, she says, however, conversation with him was never easy, even when he seemed happy. But a meeting with him in which just a few words were exchanged could be far more stimulating than with anyone else. And then she finishes up. In his company, we became more intelligent. We felt compelled to articulate whatever was best and most serious in us, and we got rid of commonplace notions, imprecise thoughts, incoherent ideas. Amen. And she's talking about her writing. Okay, so her writing for me is a little bit the way she's describing her friend. And so I thought that it was a very illuminating essay, and it was just beautifully done.
Just to interject, I feel very lucky to have had at least two friends like that, in whose I can never have never enter into an ordinary conversation or ill-equipped to discuss anything. If I felt incapacitated in any way, I would not start because I want to enjoy that. There's always a level that you brought up to that you want to maintain. And I think that was a great description of that kind of person.
So this is the great friend is Cesare Pavese, the Italian poet, and she uses the we there because there was a group of people around him. So the we is justifiable here. She's not just talking about herself. She's talking about this circle of people. I think here she also does a beautiful job on 17 of invoking his physical presence. He had a cautious, reserved way of shaking hands. A few fingers were extended and withdrawn. A secretive, parsimonious way of taking his tobacco from its pouch and filling his pipe. And if he knew that we needed money, he had a sudden, brusque way of giving it to us, so brusque and sudden that we were left rather bewildered. He used to say that he felt he should be careful with the money he had and that it hurt him to part with it. But once it was gone, he didn't give a damn about it.
It's amazing how she can take a semicolon and make two completely different ideas on each side of it. And it makes sense.
Yes.
Which is exactly the third sentence of the first essay that hooks
That's right.
you, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
The infants.
it's a strange combining of elements.
She never,
I want it
yeah,
in
go ahead.
page 18 there
Yeah,
at the end. I think it's page 18.
yes.
Says, we felt humiliated by the fact that we bored him, but we were unable to tell him that we saw only too clearly where his mistake lay. In his refusal to love the daily current of existence, which flows on evenly, And to me, that was like the essence. How do you love the daily current of existence? Wow,
Yeah,
that blew me away.
yeah, it's interesting. And she's talking about maybe the small pleasures of daily life, you know, the cup of coffee, the walk in the woods, the whatever it is that pleases you about ordinary day. And he was not a part of that. He was not a part of that.
Well, that's why I think she keeps on emphasizing happy, unhappy. He's always described as unhappy.
Yeah,
She says she's not even pleasant to be with when he's happy. So there's a certain kind of unrest in this guy that is so deep that, you know, they admire him and his intellect is so impressive, but he's not easy to be around, it seems.
no,
I mean, for me, one of the things I got out of this book was to love life.
Right.
Love life, meaning like every day of it. The being alive part of it, not just, you know, the high moments. Whether that's discovering the difference between, you know, one woman and another in Abruzzo, or the silence, or all the changes from looking at things as a child to looking at things as a teenager to looking at things as a single adult to looking at things as a couple, as a parent. Like, enjoy life, enjoy every moment of it, like just savor it all.
Yeah.
And every moment of it, look at the detail that's in it, whether it's his limp handshake or
The curls, brushing the curls away from his, playing with his hair. You know, it made me come to mind Fiddler on the Roof. It was so much like that in terms of the breadth, the Jewishness of it, and also the breadth of sunrise, sunset, and the differences when children are young and when they leave the house, and their choices and decisions. It was, yeah. Started humming Sunrise, Sunset, as a matter of fact, in the middle of it.
what do you think about her choice not to name him? She just calls it Portrait of a Friend, but she never says, you know, in memory of Cesare Pavese.
She holds a high value on privacy, I think. Maybe
Yeah.
not her own, but everybody else's. And she names certain people, like I think in the Abruzzi story, doesn't she name some people? Oh, the
I
name
don't
of
know
the
if she uses their
capo.
last names though. It's like
Yeah.
Annunziata.
Yeah,
And
right.
but I don't think
The
she
shop
says their
owner.
last name. She kind of defines them by the size of their fire, which I thought was phenomenal, whether it was twigs or logs. That was an amazing detail.
Yeah.
Well, and he is famous, and so and she admits that, and in fact, the way that he handles his fame, she finds very curious and interesting. But again, I mean, that's just a kind of, you know, maybe European discretion around celebrity. You don't have to name them.
You don't have to name them. Also, he was a suicide, like he chose the moment of his death, he did kill himself. So maybe she was being very careful there that she just says it, he chose to die on an ordinary stifling hot day in August. So that's how she handles it, that it was his choice, but she doesn't go into any of the details. I admire the restraint there.
By the way, Miriam, is his name Pavese? P-A-V-E?
Yeah, Pavese with a V, P-A-V-E-S-E.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking of restraint, you know, if I'm not mistaken, there's that the fact that she's Jewish was only mentioned once, and and here you are, you're living through fascist times, World War II, and her restraint is immense on that. I had no idea that she was an Italian communist, and that too is restraint. And I just have to tell a quick story. I did actually Italian communists are different. I was on a plane load of them going from Moscow to Milan before the curtain went down. And
Yeah.
they were the most materialist communists you've ever seen.
Right,
They were
exactly.
beautiful.
And Right. And they love to eat and drink and everything. They're just a whole different.
They're Italians.
That's what I mean. You can't take the Italian out of the
I had a
Italian.
similar experience in Pisa, and I never seen as much graffiti as I did communist graffiti. And all these communist guys gathered around these fancy motorcycles, just rhapsodizing, and each wanting to get a ride. It was funny, very funny.
Yeah.
Jay, what was your favorite?
Well, okay, I guess
He's gonna have a hard time saying, right?
the other side. First of all, I'm not sure that she was Jewish.
Yeah, her father was Jewish, her mother was.
And her mother was Catholic, and she was raised as an agnostic. So I'm not really sure what she was. The chapter, I thought he and I was probably as close as I came to some empathy with the book. Probably the chapter that I liked the most, maybe, was human relationship. But there's a reason for that, with a little bit of cynicism, I guess, on my part. At the very end, it says, and though we know all the long road we have traveled down in order to arrive at the point where we have a little compassion.
Mhm.
So I said, well, maybe I need to have a little compassion. And I thought about two things, very honestly, as I was reading this. I said, first of all, I look forward to hearing what Miriam has to say, because I know we're not going to agree. And secondly, boy, I know this sounds very strong, and I mentioned it in something to Doreen. I was reminded of a book that I read an awful long time ago that had nothing to do with this, which is called Advise and Consent by Drury. And there is one line in there which is stuck with me forever and ever. And it was during a debate in the Senate when the senator from South Carolina was going on about some items, and in the middle of what he was saying, he was requested to yield the floor. And he says in this great, and I can picture this, and I guess, and I did see the movie, so maybe I have Charles Lawton all tied up in this, but he says in this great, long Southern Charles Lawton accent, "Sir, certainly I will yield the floor because I can afford to be magnanimous." The whole thing about her attacking bourgeois, she could afford to attack bourgeois because she was bourgeois. She could escape it and go live in Ambrosia somewhere, and she could wear these old shoes because she knew that she could always go home. And so I don't know. Even the part about when she's talking about when they're in exile, I didn't find her to be restrained. I felt her to be either oblivious or cold. That, do you understand what's happening? Do you know why you're in exile? Do you realize they're going to kill your husband? And you're into what ice cream we're going to have and how we make everybody happy. I didn't feel that she had this great human touch. I'm sorry. I felt that the cynicism, yeah, that was there. But I felt that she was either oblivious to what was going on quite often, obviously very opinionated. Money was not important to her because she had money. Money is not important when you don't need money. Money is only important when you do need money. And so she can go on and on about that. And I'm going, well, you just broke my clay apple, because you didn't understand what it was like to really not have money. you played like you didn't. And so I don't know. I think Miriam best summarized it at the beginning when she said, she didn't speak to me.
Mm. Jay, you know what, I identify a lot with what you're saying, and the way that, and it actually layered on curiosity about the book to me. She's restrained, and yet also, and what you just mentioned, I would take to the level of disassociation, which is not a very nice psychological state to be in. It's like inability to face reality. And that coldness and indifference, and I felt that at various times. And even though, so she doesn't really go into her World War II experience, as an exile or being persecuted or those kind of things very much. But for me, that was an underlying kind of theme or current to the entire book, which is my curiosity about her inability to actually go to the core of some things.
You know what? It seems like, however, she had a real strong awareness of the quixotic nature of life, and that your circumstances can turn on a dime.
Mm-hmm.
And she admits that, and she doesn't pretend that she's beyond that and that her circumstances can't change. But I think that what she does in Abruzzo, for instance, is to try. Yes, they're in exile, and she can't bear being away from her home and all of the things that make her home, but she wants to make the most of the time and recognize the people that are around her and the life that is around her, and appreciate it as much as she can, so she doesn't become disdainful of of life. She wants to be connected with it no matter where she is, and they happen to be there. I thought that was noble.
The winter in the Abruzzi, for me, is my favorite essay. I find it so memorable. You notice she says, winter in the Abruzzi, God has given us this moment of peace. When the husband and the children were sent into exile by the fascists, she thought that they were going to survive. It wasn't that she was unaware of what was going on, but she thought that they had this peaceful time and that the awful things that happened hadn't happened yet. And in this sense, and what you call coldness, I would call objectivity. So, there are people who say, if while you're writing, you're weeping, you're not going to produce good work.
Mm-hmm.
And Chekhov, who had wonderful things to say about writing, he would say, if you want to talk about emotion, don't express the emotion, describe what's happening in the setting where the emotion is occurring, which I thought was wonderful advice, a way to get at objectivity. And she has that distilled, cool eye about things. Winter in the Abruzzi is a memory piece. And I look at it as a memoir. And, when you sit down to write, how the hell do you begin it? And she tries to get to the essence. I mean, if I were going to try to write about Concord, New Hampshire, I don't know what two sentences I would come up with to kind of convey the essence of a place. So that's so difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
I also did not find her cold.
Yeah.
I found her, I would agree with Miriam. It's more like accurate.
Yeah.
Trying to look at the detail and see that moment and describe it as accurately as you can, whatever you might feel about it.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Freud had a view of memory. He would say, you don't remember everything, but the things that come to the surface are the important things. Whitman described it as these dripping poignant moments that will come back to you. If everything came back to you, you couldn't have a life, right? So this is where I find, God has given us this moment of peace. So they found peace in the Abruzzi. Her husband made the mistake of going back to Rome.
I want to add, yeah, and that I agree with everything that everyone said, because I think the book is complex, and she is a complex person. At the very end of the essay we're talking about, second to last paragraph, page 8, she says, our dreams are never realized, and as soon as we see them betrayed, we realize that the intensest joys of our life have nothing to do with reality. And
Yeah.
so that she is in a certain level, and it's part of her charm as a writer. She's living in a fantasy land. So that's where I sort of get this underlying current of disassociation. That her
Yeah.
vocation is so strong, it's a means of escape.
Also, I
and
think
so-
she's an impressionist,
Mhm.
especially when she's talking about the difference between she and her husband. She says he remembers everything about the movie, like, oh, that actress, I have to see that actress. And then as soon as the actress comes up on the screen, he wants to go home. And she goes, I want to see the end of the movie. And she describes herself as absorbing things that she's interested. He said she has no curiosity. Well, she says, I do about very few things, but when I do, I absorb those things. And then I have what she doesn't use the word impressions, but impressionistic impulses about it. Things like figurative or non-figurative, I don't know what they are. They're just nebulous ideas, but they conjure up, when she can capture them in her memory, they conjure up the whole feeling that she had in experiencing what that was.
Yes, and on the very first page of this essay, this memoir, I would call it, the descriptions of the houses, and some of the houses were elegantly built. They were like small villas with terraces and little columns. And when you entered them, you would be astonished to find large, dark kitchens with hams hanging from the ceilings and vast, dirty, empty rooms. In the kitchen, a fire would be burning, and there were various kinds of fire. There were the great fires of oak logs, fires of branches and leaves, fires of twigs picked up one by one in the street. It was easier to tell the rich from the poor by looking at the fires they burned than by looking at the houses or at the people themselves or at their clothes and shoes, which are more or less the same. So there what a picture in just a few sentences.
Yeah, and the animals living in the house and the people living out back.
Yes, yes. When the first snows began to fall, a quiet sadness took hold of us. We were in exile. The city was a long way off, and so were books, friends, the various desultory events of a real existence. And then we have exile was the eagle, the murmur of the green stove. This is, again, what Robert, you said about impressionistic.
Yeah.
Exile was the eagle, the murmur of the green stove, the vast silent countryside, and the motionless snow. At 5 o'clock, the bell of the church of Santa Maria would ring, and the women with their black shawls and red faces went to benediction. Every evening, my husband and I went for a walk. I always loved that, about Italian places. I remember being in Spoleto, and people would make, there was a place where people would walk in the evening after dinner. And it seemed like the whole town came out and revolved, and they become part of this.
Like a Mexican paseo.
The paseo.
Mhm.
How do you say it in Italian? Passaggio, I think, something like that.
But they're also amazed that she's taking children out in the snow.
Yes. What did the poor sinners do that you have to take them out? They should be bundled up. And, so I don't know, as far as being a memoir that brings you to this distilled portrait of a place, I think there's very few things that would come close to that.
Hemingway sometimes in describing places will touch on that, but not I don't think
Yes,
as intensely.
yes. Marguerite Duras, the French writer, has some of this very distilled, spare a writing style as well. So I always loved that piece. It always stayed with me. And that's how I would describe her writing style, as impressionistic. Yes, Robert said that, I agree. And distilled and very highly selective and memoristic.
Yeah,
Definitely.
you know, I wanted to add to that. I thought of something quite similar, but episodic, and almost never boring. I don't usually like using movie metaphors, but there is something Fellini-esque, and that maybe that's the episodic part and the quirkiness. You get this quick vignette that seems very Italian, very small town, and she just sort of jumps in and out with ease. It is poetic, and she does write a very interesting sentence on poetic beauty, and I think this might apply to her in her essay My Vocation, page 66, top paragraph. She says, because poetic beauty is a mixture of ruthlessness, pride, irony, physical tenderness, of imagination and memory, of clarity and obscurity. And if we cannot gather all these things together, we are left with something meager, unreliable, and hardly alive.
Got to be all.
She's all in. There's no doubt about that.
Exactly. And we have to remember that, you know, the original use of that word vocation was for a religious vocation.
Yes.
You know, do you have the vocation to follow God, to join a religious thought, or to become a nun, to become a priest, to be, you know, and
Yeah, you have to swear obedience, and you have to swear that you won't go anywhere, that you're going to stay and you're going to do your job.
and you're going to do your job with utter commitment. And
Right.
I think that essay, My Vocation, is very, very striking, and it's rather frightening as well.
It almost dips into the cultish, as though it's as almost as though a third party takes control of her. It is frightening.
Yeah.
And she even ends the essay by saying it is a vocation which also feeds on terrible things.
Yes.
And again, this is my thinking. She's suppressed to a certain extent the things that happened to her and what she saw during World War II. It is a vocation which also feeds on terrible things. It swallows the best and the worst in our lives, and our evil feelings flow in its blood just as much as our benevolent feelings. It feeds itself and grows within us. That sounds a little bit crazy. I mean, that's how intense can a vocation get that it overpowers?
Yeah, very, very strong, very strong. And without it, yeah, she's desolate. It was also interesting in that piece, when she has children, she can't imagine, you know, taking care of children and then also writing. And then finally, she begins to write a long piece. She has someone take the children in the afternoon, and it all comes to her. It just flows, and she writes and she writes and she writes. I've been reading an interesting poet, Jane Kenyon, whose work is very good, a Christian writer, really. And she describes in one interview how there's a poem of hers called Let Evening Come, a very beautiful poem. And the interviewer asks her, well, how did you come to write that poem? And she said, it just came to me. And she was just sort of flooded with that. And when I read what Ginzburg had written about, you know, how she opened up with that long piece, I thought of Jane Kenyon as well. Definitely. Well, Vivian Gornick, a very interesting American writer, said that that Ginzburg's work made her love life more. And I puzzled over that. What could she mean? Did she mean this because Ginzburg came through such fraught, awful times and somehow renewed her faith? what did she actually mean? I'm not sure.
Well,
What-
I thought she meant to appreciate each moment. You know, so you're in Abruzzi and you're in exile, like look around you, see what there is. Enjoy it, enjoy learning about it, whatever it is.
Whatever it
That's-
is, yes, whatever it is.
In
And then,
the
yeah, Robert,
little virtues, she comes out and says, connecting the vocation with the little virtues. And what is a human being's vocation but the highest expression of his love of life? That was a rather strong statement.
very,
But having read her ideas about vocation, it wasn't surprising. But she also says, love of life begets a love of life.
And that's what she had said earlier in the piece about the friend,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That he didn't know how to love daily life. And then
Right.
she finishes, love of life begets love of life. So that's what I understood it to mean.
yeah.
so there's that, and also she embraces tremendous contradictions, doesn't she? I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
you know, in the Son of Man, we, you know, when she says we've looked at horrible things, we've seen the worst of the worst and the worst, and yet she goes on. Nevertheless, and in human relationships, you know, she arrives at, you know, this vision of what it would be possible in human relationships to think neither of being a master or a servant. And to me, that is an affirmation of life, like her questioning, you know, what would be the human relationships that would transcend all the pettiness if we could just look at each other with sort of naked eyes and not always be vying for power. I thought of what the hell is going on in our legislature right now. You know, who's the master, who's the servant? It's a sort of endless struggle. And she tries to puzzle her way through that. So what does that mean? I mean, if you're thinking about all of these things, doesn't that mean you love life? In Silence, she talks about acedia, which is apathy. And there's nothing apathetic in these essays, right?
No.
Mhm.
But it's tied so closely to the idea of her being a moralist, because she says at one point, being moderate with oneself and generous with others. That's her idea of where we need to be. One person's disaster is everyone's disaster. That's not a slave master thing. That's everyone is to be considered equal. She must have hated Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand is very popular in New Hampshire because of the whole, you know, libertarianism.
I know. Oh,
But I find Rand kind of a bit of a fascist because it's like the superior being.
absolutely.
Yeah, the superior
And
being.
I was so eager to read that when I was in my late teens.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wanted to see the movie, and I thought it was so heroic, but God.
I didn't, when I think about moralist, I was thinking of it in terms of her trying to give advice
Yes,
on what is a good life,
good point.
you know, so like live this way, don't live that way. And I found it very refreshing, the part about money, because, and I think within capitalism, a lot of times we don't talk about our relationship with money. It's kind of, you don't talk about how much money you have. You don't talk about so many aspects of the relationship to money. And it was very refreshing for me to see how she talks about it, you know, not to be a slave to it. And she mentioned it again in the other essay where she said, you know, he thought about it and then when he got rid of it, it was gone. I find we don't talk enough about something that's so important in our society, but our relationship to it is just glossed over.
Yeah.
And I found it very refreshing. It
And
made
in
me
raising
think a lot
children.
about my own relationship with money,
Yeah.
which is kind of fucked up.
Yeah.
In raising children, not to reward them for scholarship or doing well in school, and saying that money is your wages. It's not a reward. And that's a hard thing for young kids to understand. When she talked about the bicycle and holding the bicycle back and letting the child have the bicycle, and it's complicated because there are very different opinions about child raising, and some of them have to do with making the kid earn every penny. That she says just give them the money and let them spend it so that they know that it comes and it goes, and they're not responsible for earning it. It's not like they did something wonderful and they're being rewarded.
I'd like to add something, sorry, on the essay Silence. And
Oh,
it gets a little bit and explain a little bit why it was one of my favorites. That by the book's end, she does seem to be on some kind of soul search. So she's returning perhaps to some roots. That was just a vague feeling that I have. But she's very ahead of her time in recognizing some dangers, which seem kind of widespread now. Page 72, last paragraph. She's talking about silence as being, how to put it, it's kind of like, I guess, source of dis-ease or something. But for this reason, because one person's disaster is everyone's disaster, the ways of curing this silence that have been suggested to us are clearly unreal. We have been advised to defend ourselves from despair with egotism. But egotism has never solved despair. And we are too used to calling our soul's vices illnesses, to putting up with them and to letting them rule our lives, or to smoothing them with sweet syrups in order to cure them as if they were illnesses, right? And so today, any failing on anyone's part is due to illness, right? And she's saying a nice, loud, clear, no way.
Mm-hmm. Silence must be faced and judged from a moral standpoint.
Exactly. Thank you.
Because silence, like acedia and like luxury, is a sin.
Mm-hmm.
Silence.
What's acedia?
Apathy.
Or sloth. I looked it up. That was a new word.
Spiritual sloth or apathy.
Hmm.
So the silence is a kind of withdrawal from life and from connection with others.
And she does talk about taking moral responsibility. So she's not into excusing things.
Yeah, well, silence is also a refusal to see what's in front of you and say it, admit that it's there and acknowledge it. It has to do with not saying, it must be faced and judged from a moral standpoint, she says. And I think she means it.
She means in terms of like justice, right?
Yeah, I think so, but that's unfairness or injustice. Yeah, right. Seems to me.
Mhm.
This is on 71, the bottom.
So I had a question for you, Miriam. Why is she not well known?
Well, she is well known. I mean,
Oh,
she's
is she?
certainly, oh yeah, she's well known in Italy. And she's, of course, not as well known in the States, but was a tremendous revival of interest in her. And there's a recent translation by Jenny McPhee of a book called Family Lexicon, which is a wonderful novel memoir of her family. I love the book. I had the earlier translation. It was called Family Sayings, but she certainly is at her best. And reading her again, to talk about her with you, I would love to get some of the other novels of hers, which I haven't read.
I
And-
did see that, Jhumpa Lahiri
Yes,
has been living in Italy and studied Italian and wrote her latest novel in Italian first and then in English to be in the head of it in Italian. And she was in a conversation about Natalia Ginzburg recently.
yeah. So she's a very, very important figure, and there, as you said, Ben, she's complicated. She's complicated. She says on 70, it is well known that a feeling of guilt is one of the vices of our time. A great deal is talked and written about it. We all suffer from it. We feel ourselves to be involved with something that gets filthier with every day that passes. And there is also a feeling of panic. We all suffer from that too. The feeling of panic comes from the feeling of guilt. And a man who is panic stricken and guilty says, stays silent. And then she talks about some people travel to get away from these kinds of things.
Or they have sex.
Oh, yes, that's another. I mean, also we're living in an age of addiction,
Yeah.
tremendous.
Can I ask if anybody had any reverberations from Eddie Hillison? Not that they're at all similar, but I was trying to think about the way they described so-called reality, or what was in their presence. I don't know, it just seemed to resonate a little bit with me. I haven't gone back to look at the book afterwards, look at the notes that I wrote, but it just occurred to me. I wondered if it had with anybody.
Yeah, it hadn't, but it might be an interesting connection, I think.
Mhm.
Well, we have a lot to say about Ginsburg, don't we? Jay, I think we still haven't convinced you.
Now, my favorite quote was one from her that was not in the book, but she said to a sick friend of hers, "You're not sick, you just have defective parts." So I found that she had great sense of humor somewhere.
Well, she certainly lived in history and suffered from history. After the war, Jay, I have to defend her. She didn't have any money. She didn't. She had to send the children elsewhere and she worked all her life to earn her living. So I don't think it's a sin to be born into the middle class. I don't think it's a sin to be born into any class, but she had to earn her living. And things in Italy after the Second World War were very bad, as you know.
Mhm.
They were awful. No food.
I just want to say before we run out of time, I thought that her living in London and her attitudes and things she had to say about the British were absolutely spot on and hilarious.
They were.
They were. That's true.
Hilarious. I loved when she talks about in London, which is a black and gray city, man has placed a few colors with a U with precision and forethought. You can suddenly find a blue or red or pink front door among its black brothers. The buses that pass by in the gray air are painted a vivid red. These are colors that would be cheerful anywhere else, but here they are not cheerful. Set in place in such an exact and deliberate way, they are like the weak, sad smile of someone who doesn't know how to smile. I thought that was brilliant. Brilliant.
It was. I agree with you.
And she riffs on this wonderful old dichotomy between Southern European, Mediterranean, out on the street, your heart on your sleeve, and those ultra rational, somewhat cold, frigid, and inaccessible Northerners,
Yeah.
very much including the English.
Yeah. They have no imagination.
Yeah.
She
And
said.
if you think of it, we in Miami, we have a nice combination of both, don't we? All those New Yorkers and
And a few Latins.
a lot.
Well, it was very refreshing to read her again. I mean, we're living in a period where there's such a worship of money. I mean, you open the business pages of the New York Times, sometimes there's advice about, how to educate your children about financial matters.
Oh,
And among the list is things, get them to buy stocks at a very early age and to follow the stock market. Well, yeah, that's good in one way. If you start, or as soon as they get their first job, to have them put money into a pension fund. So, because the longer you have money in, the more money that, and the money.
Amen, Miriam. And the Bible calls it mammon, right?
Yeah.
And it's idol worship. And so
Right.
there's no doubt about it that we have elevated materialism to the highest form of idol worship.
well, we have a couple living in our building. The one guy is of an Italian background, and his girlfriend is Russian, and they're lovely. And they just had a baby, and he named the baby Roman. He was trying to decide between Roman and Romulus, and I think he made the right choice. But anyway, Jim and I put $25 in cash in an envelope with a card and left it under their desk to congratulate them. And we got a card back from Ina, her name is Inna, and she's very good in English, and she writes beautifully. So she just said, we were hoping you would be home so we could thank you in person, but thank you so much. And she said, we couldn't decide whether with his first gift, Roman should buy a little pair of Air Jordans, or if he should buy some Bitcoins. And she said, and then Roman shrieked out, "Oh, those shoes are so over, the Bitcoins. And then she said, well, we'll let you know if he becomes a millionaire by the time he's 10. And then with her Russian disdain, she wrote in Russian at the bottom in Cyrillic, "Thank you." But you know what she feels about the Bitcoins. Even though her boyfriend, her husband, deals a lot in Bitcoins. That's his thing.
That's his thing.
Not her thing.
Yeah. Well, to remind myself, I have what I call a dirty money collection. Have you ever walked on the street and found a penny that is so beaten up and
Oh, yeah.
oxidized? Well, I collect those. And I
I
have
have some for you.
a jar full of unspendable money, and I call it the dirty money jar. And it kind of reminds me of the possible uselessness of money. And I ask my friends, if you find something like that, please send it to me.
Well, especially pennies, because they're not going to be around anymore.
And they get very thin. I mean, I love the oxidation, and reminds me of, this too shall pass kind of thing.
I pick up pennies also out of respect for Abraham Lincoln.
Well, that's it too. That's
Okay,
enough.
so I'm not going to let him be desecrated on the street.
Or trod upon.
Even if we've allowed inflation to devalue his coin to worthlessness.
Right.
Well, I because of Benjamin Franklin, a penny saved is a penny earned.
So how is everybody doing? Did anybody get a booster shot, or how is that going?
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording so then you can share private medical